these plots here were done into what was originally pasture. So it was into sod. So we mowed it and baled it to get some of the duff off of it. We sprayed it with Roundup to kill it. We let it die down. We hit it lightly with a disc to stir up some seeds in the top. We let it green up a second time. We sprayed it with Roundup again to kill it. And then later on in the fall, after it frosted, we planted it. And then the following seasons, then we kept it mowed to let the warm weather grasses have a chance. So that's how it was established.
We talked about the point the first year or two can look kind of ratty. And we've had, some scenarios where the people go, boy, my neighbors are really on me. So I think it's fair to say that we all have a role in extension and the other organizations we work with or work for to sort of help landowners that are starting to put in habitat so their neighbors and the community realizes, no, we're not creating a weedy mess here. We're creating some habitat for beneficial insects, honeybees, bumblebees, monarch butterflies. So I think we all have a lot of work to do to help make sure everybody understands with change there's things that don't seem normal. That doesn't seem like what we used to do, and that's true and fair enough. But how do we just kind of help everybody move past that change?
The biggest thing with site preparation is just having the existing vegetation under control. So in a corn or soybean field, that's largely been controlled either with tillage or with herbicide or some combination of both. So the weed bank should be relatively under control. If you're going to convert a pasture, that's going to be much harder, something that has existing perennial vegetation. You're going to want to make sure, however you can go about it, whether that's chemical control or whether that's repeated application of tillage, you're going to want to make sure that the vegetation is under control. Because by putting these prairie seeds, some of them are small, we're talking 600,000 seeds per ounce, smaller than a grain of pepper. By putting them into an area where there's already something growing that is using the nutrients, using the sunlight, absorbing that water, it's not going to have a chance, and you're not going to get your money's worth. So just controlling the existing vegetation is going to be the most important thing you can do. Yeah, seed bed. So you want kind of the opposite of what you think about with a garden. With a garden, you want it to be really fluffy and loamy. Here, you want a really firm seed bed. You can seed prairie any time of the year. You really can. I wouldn't seed prairie onto snow that's deeper than about 4 inches, and I wouldn't seed prairie in the driest part of August for here in Iowa. But that said, you can kind of seed it any time of the year. There are benefits to both. Personally, I like to seed in the fall or in the dormant period, because if you're seeding any kind of forbs or wildflowers, these are temperate wildflowers that need a period of cold, moist stratification. So essentially, you need to simulate winter. And if you put them out there in the spring, they're going to have to sit for a whole year. Some of them will germinate without having that stratification, but the wide majority of them, they're going to need to basically go through a cold, moist period in order to germinate. So if you go out in the fall, broadcast seeding is going to be the way to go. It's easy. You can move pretty quickly, just physically throwing that seed on top of the ground. The freeze-thaw cycle of the winter is just going to put that soil or seed perfectly in the level of the soil where you want. It's going to be nice and firm. Keeping the soil firm is going to, kind of keep things from drying out. There's going to be moisture on the top. So that's going to be really important. If you seed kind of any other time of the year, using a seed drill is going to be a really, really good thing. And not getting the seed too deep, but about 1/4 of an inch is how deep you want it to be. And even if it is kind of a fluffy seed bed, going back over with a cultipacker or something to kind of tamp that seed bed down, just so you don't have a drying out of that top layer and then those seeds kind of dying before they get a chance to germinate. In terms of what it's going to look like once it's planted, prairie is something that it spends the first couple years growing down. So it's working on these really deep roots, but that means that you're not going to get much above ground growth, certainly in the first year. And what you are going to see is annual weeds. So prairie is a perennial. It's going to come back from the roots every year, but with annual weeds, they're trying to grow as fast as possible, get as big as possible so they can produce as much seed as possible so then they can reproduce and move on to the next generation. So kind of the opposite of what you get with prairie. So what you want to do in the first year of your prairie is you go out and mow. Every time basically gets to about knee height, go down and mow it to about 4 to 6 inches. That's going to vary depending upon how much rain we get. You know, that might be 2 times, it might be 5 times, but just every time it gets to knee height, go out and mow it down. Because if you don't, you're essentially stranding those small prairie seedlings that are working on their deep roots. You're stranding them in just a dark, dense forest of weeds where they're going to have a really hard time out-competing those annual weeds that have a totally different life cycle. And then in the second year, you're going to have, you know, some weeds, and it's going to be good to go out and mow at least 1 time. And there, if you can lift that mower deck up a little bit, mow to about a height of 10 inches, and that's probably going to be, you know, again, when it gets to about knee height, and sometime probably in June, go out and mow it to about 10 inches. If you want to go out and mow it again, you're not going to hurt it. Just try to avoid mowing it in like late August and September. You know, leave that out there. So by going out and mowing too late in the season and mowing it down, you're going to be hurting the ability of that plant to photosynthesize and store energy in the root for the winter, basically. So prairie is something that it takes a lot of patience. You know, agronomically, it's going to be very different than the corn or soybean, where you do a little bit of field prep, you plant it, you spray it, you baby it a little bit, and then you harvest it. Where this, it's like you might only see a few blooms in the first year. You know, physically, I'm not saying a few species. You might only see a few things that are blooming just because of the mowing and that you're doing.
So one other thing to consider with seed mixes is that I know for our site, because it's on a farm and it's highly visible, it was really important to some people to have something that was showy that first year. And so, you know, work with the folks that are putting your seed mix together and try to get those options of, you know, like a black-eyed Susan or an Indian blanket or something that's really going to pop that first year, and it gets you encouraged. And so it doesn't just look all weedy, but you actually get to see flowers and they're actually attracting pollinators. And then that'll kind of give you that you know, momentum as you go through and you try to talk to your neighbors or other folks that are involved of how long it takes to get the prairie established and how long, you know, it's not just something that's going to happen overnight. You really got to practice your patience and get through it. So those little pops that can get you to the next goal really, really do help.
So when you're standing in pollinator habitat, it is a love over the years. It looks ugly at first. It looks like what folks would call a weed patch if you're thinking of this from a standard farm perspective, until you get in there and start to learn what the plants are, and that it takes multiple seasons to do that. And I think the biggest factor for farmers is they're so good at what they do in growing crops that somehow the expectation is that we should also be good at growing pollinator habitat, when they're not the same thing. It's apples and oranges. And so wanting people to understand it takes time and it takes learning to be able to do that. And we have resources. There are people who are experts, and that's the other aspect of Be Integrated that's really important, is we can put people in touch with those folks that are experts in how to do this, because they're already experts. The farmers are experts at growing crops, but we want to give them, you know, the resources they need to grow pollinator habitat. I think the view is definitely worth the climb when you look at what you're standing in. It is not a weed patch. It is gorgeous. It changes through the seasons. It's definitely worth that. And you see wildlife associated with it, not just the pollinators that we've had the chance to experience, but other insects, definitely other bird species. So it's definitely worth the effort that it takes.